time has come, brothers and sisters, for each and every one of you to decide whether you are going to be the problem or whether you are going to be the solution. You must choose, brothers. You must choose. It takes 5 seconds. 5 seconds of decision. 5 seconds to realize your purpose here on the planet. It takes 5 seconds to realize it's time to move. It's time to get down with it. Brothers, it's time to testify. And I want to know, are you ready to testify?
Before my time is through, I'm going all the way, pretty baby, to see what I can do. All the things I've been looking for, yeah, everyone I'll find. I'll see the sights, I'll hear the sounds, before the end of my time. I'm going all the way, yeah, I'm going all the way.
Gone over to East Village Other, largely because a girl I had been going out with when I came back from Japan, my book, she was going out with Walter Boart. And I said, well, you know, that's okay. Glad you found each other, but Sherry, you did promise to do the singing titogram for me for my column. And the singing titogram was to go to one of those 25-cent photo machines, and she'd do 3 pictures, and the 4th picture she'd uncover this French Legionnaire's hat to the exposed breast, you know. So we went along to that, and Walter, her new boyfriend, was quite game. And he said, oh, he said, you know, I'm starting a paper. And I said, oh, really? I'll write for you. So I sent him a column, and he ran a column in the first issue, Art and Other Scenes. He dropped it. He called it just Other Scenes. And the Voice basically kicked me out, went over to the East Village. And we sat around one day and realized there were 5 newspapers. There was the Berkeley Barb, there was the LA Free Press, there was the, in Lansing, Michigan, there was the Paper. In Austin, Texas, there was Jeff Shiro's Rag, and there was our own paper, the East Village Other. And we thought, well, we've got a syndicate here. You know, what are we going to call it? And we kicked that around. And so I think I came up with the Underground. So we called it the Underground Press Syndicate. And almost simultaneously, I get this call from Phoenix.
It seemed to me, as I recall, this revolutionary type community organizer named Jim Farrat here, who was a big gay activist, turns out. As far as I know, he sort of was introducing Prasad around.
You also have this period of the anti-war movement. You have the period of the Weather Underground. But, you know, I was like the hippie leader. I was, you know, the communication company, and I liked to talk, and I was, you know, Abby was the New York Post's hippie, you know, quote unquote, and I was the New York Times hippie, because I would actually talk to them. You know, I wouldn't just say crazy things to freak them out. Tom came to my law. And I'm trying to remember, you know, to this day, I can't remember. Someone brought him over. It might have been Rex Weiner.
We had a little newspaper called the New York Ace, and we needed an office for it. Tom was introduced to me by, I guess, John Wilcock.
Tom, let's be partners. Let's open a bank account. We both have to sign the checks. So, and I said I would write a newsletter every month, and he would print it and send it out. And the first communication I got from him was Phoenix with the bullet holes through it. And then Orpheus, yes. So not long afterwards, he came to New York and set up that place on, I believe, West 10th Street, right by the sidewalk. Just always had a canister of nitrous outside. And and his tribe and everything. And he basically took over UPS. I was only really happy to have him do that, of course.
When Tom was in Arizona, he started collecting every single underground newspaper in the country and had the most extensive library of the underground press. And when he heard about UPS in New York, he contacted Boert and Wilcock, who were the originators of the underground press syndicate, and came to work with them on the project. His initial magazine there in Arizona, the Orpheus, was really a compilation of the best of the underground press. That's the way Tom conceived it. He got exposed to all the great counterculture publications around the country and knew what they were doing, who the best writers were, and who the best organizers were around the country. And he very quickly came to the conclusion that John Sinclair, who had organized the White Panther Party in Ann Arbor and Detroit, was, in his mind, the most enlightened leader of the counterculture revolution.
Yeah, well, I was a beatnik. I wanted to be a beatnik. And I went to Detroit to go to graduate school at Wayne State. And I wanted to meet the beatniks and be part of it. And I already was into jazz, and I was hooked. I'd been going to jazz clubs, and I knew the guys with the weed. I was a pothead. I'd already taken peyote, looking for LSD. All of this, but I was involved as a poet and a writer and a music fanatic, as a cultural activist. That was my background. And a pothead. Well, the pothead part was what drew the police. And so and then I remember in January of 1965 receiving a flyer in the mail from Allen Ginsberg and Ed Sanders saying, Lemar, legalize marijuana. I said, man, what a great thing. We got to have one of those in Detroit. So I went there, made me a grab machine, and made a flyer that said Detroit Lemar. Well, I imagine you could date my real problems with the police to that. And it just kept on. I got busted, I copped a plea, I got busted again, I wanted to fight the law. I fought the law for 5 years. For 2.5 years, I was on bond, trying to get them to rule that the law was unconstitutional, that marijuana was not a narcotic, that 10 years for possession, 20 to life for sale was cruel and unusual punishment. Well, they wouldn't rule on this without a conviction. So I went to trial and got the conviction.
For some reason, the people around John didn't trust Tom Forcade. This was one of the problems, that Tom was such a mysterious character, and there was such paranoia at the time that a lot of people just saw Tom coming out of nowhere and trying to take over the movement, when in fact Tom was one of the most dedicated revolutionaries that the movement had, but he was just moving much faster than the people around him.
And that's when they put the shit in the game, because then they wouldn't give me an appeal bond. And I was in prison for 2.5 years until I was granted appeal bond, after John Lennon came to show for me. And a lot of other people were there. Forcade was there, lighting firecrackers on the stage. And so then I got out. After that, and 3 months later, the Supreme Court ruled in my favor and overthrew the marijuana laws in the state of Michigan. And in the meantime, I did all kinds of other cultural things, like I started managing the MC5. I built them into kind of a popular attraction. They had a lot of thousands of kids following them. They got a record contract with Elektra the day we recorded our album. Then we created the White Panther Party. We wanted to be more than just a rock and roll band. We wanted to say something. So we said, we're White Panthers, we support the Black Panther Party. We want to overthrow the government. Rock and roll is a weapon of cultural revolution,
Long before the Woodstock Festival, the National Security State had already realized they had a problem, as they had no influencers in the teenage culture that emerged almost overnight in the wake of Bob Dylan and the Beatles. Dylan was way too smart to get sucked into their dialectical games, although he was targeted and hounded by many, including Weatherman, who used the street performer Peel to spread the word that Dylan was an MK Ultra secretly controlled by the CIA.
J, Weatherman. Bob Dylan's not your enemy, he's just your friend. You are just a Dylanologist.
After analyzing his music, Weatherman concluded that only he could interpret the secret messages Dylan was trying to get out. Weatherman demanded Dylan's brain be returned to the people. He also launched the Paul is dead meme that spiraled into the supermarket tabloids. His crackpot reinterpretations of popular songs was rivaled only by Charlie Manson, who would explain why he was getting secret messages from the Beatles saying it was okay to wreak havoc and murder on straight people and pigs. Something had to be done with the emerging counterculture media, most of which was being run by teenagers, before these papers established a foothold. The American media had long ago been compromised after the J.P. Morgan firm funded a study on how much it would take to buy up enough newspapers to control the national media. Turns out it wasn't all that expensive, so their fronts went around getting control of every major publication in secret, and the big ones had national security reporters working close with military intelligence on managing the national mindset. British intelligence was also on board, which is why I find it suspicious a British journalist arrived in 1955 to start the underground media, first at The Voice and then the more radical East Village Other, which was designed to appeal to the new politically aware teen culture minted by Dylan that had picked up guitars and marijuana cigarettes. Two of the exploiters that arrived on the scene were a couple of con men named Tom Foreman and Bert Cohn, who were running a company called Concert Hall in Pennsylvania. They contacted the underground papers and offered to sell ads and wound up being promoters for the Woodstock Festival. The recently created Rolling Stone magazine was bombarding the major labels, advising them to stop all ads in the underground press because the founders were anti-capitalistic. Working for Concert Hall was a secretary named Cindy Ornstein, who had been a Goldwater Republican and whose mother penned pro-war editorials in Time, Newsweek, and the New York Times. Ornstein was one of the few women who could stand toe-to-toe with Facade, and they quickly became a team. She would put up the stash of money to create High Times, perhaps donated by her mother, who suspected Facade was in fact a government agent.
He was this eminence gris from the lunch bucket of America, I mean the armpit of America, somewhere way out there in among the mesas and the tumbleweeds and cactus. Here came this guy out of a Sergio Leone spaghetti western with a slouch hat and handlebar mustache, being very grim and very intimidating and absolutely brilliant.
There's a culture divide between the Yippies who came from New York and the kids that were drawn out from the Midwest to protest with them. And both sides never successfully bridged that divide.
I met Tom in '69 when he brought in a big a load of hash, Afghani hash.
And Forcade had pot that was really fucking cheap compared to what everybody else was selling it for at the time. The first thing I remember about him is he says, well, what do you think about these guys, about Abby and Jerry? I says, oh, they're pretty cool. And he steps back a couple of feet and says, you gotta be kidding, you know. You like those guys?
In 1965, a Dutchman named Robert Jasper Grootveld took a trip to Africa and fell in with a tribal shaman. And after returning home, Grootveld began holding improvisational performances in front of a statue that had been erected by the tobacco industry, dressed like a tribal shaman. Grootveld thought it insane that tobacco, which killed people with cancer, was legal, while marijuana, which killed no one and was a lot of fun, was illegal.
A happening in Holland by the Provo's. Beatniks? Or is there method in their madness?
A happening is a happening is a happening is a happening is a happening. Everything is happening.
These protests involved singing an anti-smoking song and throwing a ring of fire over the statue. His performances drew hundreds and then thousands of teenagers who soon became known as the Nosums. Eventually, a movement called Provo emerged. One of the first big plans was to collect a lot of bicycles, paint them all white, and leave them unlocked and allow anyone to ride them. But when the white bikes began appearing, the police quickly confiscated them all. Provo claimed to be composed of beatniks, jailbirds, magicians, pacifists, charlatans, philosophers, germ carriers, happeners, vegetarians, Santa Clausers, kindergarten teachers, agitators, pyromaniacs, secret police, and other riffraff. They agitated against capitalism, communism, fascism, bureaucracy, militarism, professionalism, dogmatism, and authoritarianism. They realized their cause was hopeless, but could not pass up a chance to make a heartfelt attempt to provoke society into confronting its ills. They only lasted a few years, but the Provos are the reason why cannabis was made legal in Holland decades before anywhere else in the world. And they also launched a global art movement known as Happenings. Peter Schumann in New York City, John Cage in Champaign, Illinois, and Emmett Grogan in San Francisco became major contributors. But the most influential figure was Ken Kesey and his band of merry pranksters. The unifying concept of all these groups was to use humor as a path to enlightenment. The Diggers founded a free kitchen in Golden Gate Park for feeding runaway teens who were flooding the city, many of whom were sleeping in the park, as well as a free store on Haight Street that provided clothes and other essentials. The Diggers were into recycling, and much of their supplies were rescued from garbage bins. Abby Hoffman traveled to the West Coast and checked out Grogan and soon changed his appearance and political tactics. Soon Hoffman would visit Wall Street to drop dollar bills from the balcony of the New York Stock Exchange just to watch the traders scurry about like rats. Dana Beal tried to form a New York City version of Provo but got no traction. He would organize the first New York City pot rally. John Reed was born with a golden spoon in his mouth. Portland's leading businessman, Henry Dodge Green, was his grandfather on his mother's side, but the real money for his upbringing came from his father, an executive at an agricultural machine manufacturer. Reed was a popular student at Harvard, president of the Glee Club. He was named Ivy Orator and Poet in his senior year. This was just the sort of resume that would have attracted immense interest from the national security state that prowls the corridors of major universities, looking for those with just the right qualifications to mold into successful influencers. Many of these ops are accomplished without the target even realizing there's a hidden hand manipulating their trajectory. Reed was launched after reporting on Pancho Villa's revolution in Mexico, a book that never revealed the crucial fact that that stogie in Villa's mouth was cannabis and not tobacco. Most Americans would have to wait for Mez Mesro and Jack Kerouac to get clued into the benefits of weed. Reed created the Communist Party in America, as well as a publication called The Liberator to promote the communist cause. But his real job was visiting Russia, where he could meet with the communist leaders and secretly report back to his controllers in our national security system. Nothing in politics happens by chance, and the elevation of communism to the chosen competitor to capitalism was made by the banks willing to fund the movements. These banks intentionally failed to support democratic movements. Fascism, communism, and capitalism were the three horses in the race, and it didn't matter which one won because the banks were in control of the spigot on all three. Dorothy Day would inherit Reed's title of King of Chief Revolutionaries. She had no fancy pedigree but had converted to Catholicism in her early 30s, which gave her immense bona fides that undoubtedly assisted her meteoric rise to influencer. She was introduced to that faith during an intense love affair with Eugene O'Neill. And then along came David Dillinger, who had the pedigree and the religious fervor. His father was a close friend of President Calvin Coolidge, while his mother was a Card King member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Dillinger was a half step up on the oligarchic ladder from Reed, as he attended Yale, the supreme breeding ground of master spooks, some of whom managed the selected opposition to our status quo, like John Kerry, for example. Dillinger attended Oxford and then joined the Union Theological Seminary at Columbia University. He introduced Jerry Rubin to Abbie Hoffman and promoted Rubin's rise to the top of the counterculture revolution. He also connected Rubin with the Weatherman, K, Beale, and Peel axis of influence. As soon as the Vietnam War ended, Rubin would be the first influencer to put on a suit and tie and join the opposition.
We felt that we had to go from protest to resistance on a national scale because the war was getting expanding horrendously.
He was jailed twice for refusing to register for the draft. He's traveled in Cuba, Japan, Cambodia, South Vietnam, China, and North Vietnam.
Since you look like most Americans, you dress in the mainstream fashion.
Well, that's a false assumption because there are many different styles for Americans.
John Lennon, Yoko Ono, New York City are your people.
And we met David. Well, somebody took us down, either Howard Smith or Jerry, said, you've got to come see this guy who sings in the park, you know. Crazy guy. Well, you don't have to say it, David, they'll know. And so we went down, there was this crazy guy shouting about rip-off rock stars and all that. And I thought,
The Dick Cavett Show. Tonight with special guests, John Lennon and Yoko Ono.
After Tom's dispute with Hoffman, he split from the Yippies and aligned himself with Beale and Weatherman, large-scale pot dealers. David Peel served as their court jester and troubadour. The Living Theater had been performing improvisational street theater since the 1950s, but in the 1960s, after they sparked an anti-war movement with street theater, they were targeted and hounded out of the country by the IRS. They fled to Europe to survive and would not return for a decade. Tim Leary was anointed by the media as the original acid guru, but he had competition from Stephen Gaskin in San Francisco. Leary, Gaskin, Kesey, they were all indicted on trumped-up marijuana charges. Leary and Gaskin were put in jail. Kesey fled to Mexico and disappeared. The imprisonment of the leaders of the counterculture left a vacuum that was soon occupied by Hoffman and Rubin, who, along with Paul Krasner and a few others, formed the Yippies, an attempt to politicize the apathetic hippies, many of whom abhorred talk of politics. Actually, few teenagers identified as hippies at that time, which began as a put-down created by the media. Those of us on the inside called ourselves freaks.
His throwing of the pie at the Obscenity Commission in Washington, D.C. was the inspiration for something that I began, an organization called Agents Pie Kill. And we trained people in how to get in, how to get out, how to hit them quick. And we had about a dozen agents, and you can look it up in Time magazine online.
And I thought it was funny, a rabbi getting it, poking fun. It's something that I came out of. I figured, why not? Because I was into a more anti-religious trip then. I figured all clergy need to get it.
He wanted me and my band, the Lower East Side, to go to a counter rally for the Medicine Ball Caravan. He saw a Woodstock on the road being exploited by Warner Brothers. Okay, so he flew me in, me and my band, the Lower East Side, joined the caravan, and call ourselves the Caravan of Pirates. Hey, baby!
Tom helped publicize Woodstock. Most of the publicity was done through the underground press. Tom missed the actual festival, and I think he realized that Woodstock had captured the center of gravity on the counterculture revolution by assembling so many people in one place at one time. But he also saw that Warner Brothers had gotten the film rights and had basically usurped the movement, and instead of all this money going to help build up the movement, it was going to Warner Brothers. So right after Woodstock, Warner Brothers had another concept, which was they were going to create a Woodstock that was going to travel around the country. It was kind of a mixture of the Merry Pranksters bus tour of America with the Woodstock Festival. They're going to merge those two ideas. So Tom launched his own project, which was to follow the caravan around and have a counter demonstration against it to educate people that this was a Warner Brothers ripoff, basically. And he did that by converting a black Cadillac and building a stage on top and putting these Minuteman speakers, these very powerful speakers.
Even Nixon showed you love with 50,000 people dead in Vietnam. General Motors showed you love. 53,000 people dying on the roads. Nobody sees it because they don't want to.
You're going to film a film about that kind of thing, you better show Freddie Weintraub giving Wavy Gravy the instructions to be a groovy hippie and not have any crazy stickers on his car.
Like that cat's a brother, you're a brother, everybody in the world's a brother. We got to get it together.
Just as the anti-slavery pro-Civil War movement was launched from the pulpit, something similar happened with the 1960s anti-war movement, which was launched out of Unitarian churches and promoted by a Catholic magazine called Ramparts, run by Warren Hinkle. The Red Herring in Urbana, Illinois included the first vegetarian restaurant in town, and all the major protests at the University of Illinois originated from inside that church. The Red Herring also had a stage that launched the careers of many folk singers, including Dan Fogelberg and Tom Bishop. While still in local high school, Irving Azoff, who would later take over the music industry, worked as an assistant for the local booking agent, Bob Nutt. The core of SDS emerged from three college towns located close to each other, Madison, Champaign-Urbana, and Ann Arbor. And that's where the FBI placed numerous infiltrators whose primary job was to incite violence. The FBI was most worried about the Black Panthers because they fought back with guns. But it was a pacifist Panther in Chicago they were most worried about, Fred Hampton, who was denouncing Bernadine Dorn, who had just stolen the SDS mailing list. Dorn lauded Charlie Manson for killing pigs and advised college students to go underground and prepare for war. The straight people would be put in concentration camps once the revolution succeeded.
The massacres in Vietnam and the daily massacres that go on against the people of the world have occurred.
Jerry Rubin advised teens to kill their parents. The calls for violence didn't get much traction until Hampton was assassinated by the Chicago police connected to the CIA and FBI. Hampton was shot while sleeping after having been slipped a pill from a trusted bodyguard who turned out to be an FBI plant. The crime scene was bizarrely left wide open, and Dorn was the first to arrive and began leading press tours, giving interviews, revealing all the hundreds of incoming bullet holes while none were outgoing. So the story told by the cops that this had been a gunfight while trying to serve a warrant was a complete transparent farce. This killing launched the Weather Underground into the national media, though they never posed any real threat as they were too busy feeding their troops LSD while forcing them into orgies where straight men were commanded to suck each other off in order to break through their hang-ups. This was designed to prepare them for killing cops. There was a whole host of wacky cults doing similar mind control experiments with LSD, and in hindsight, most of them were probably intelligence operations, all part of James Angleton's Operation Chaos. LSD was something the CIA had a virtual monopoly on, although most of the street chemists never realized who they were actually working for. The biggest player was Billy Hitchcock of the Mellon family, who would later turn into chemists who worked for him, while claiming he was protected because he was stashing profits in a CIA-approved bank in the Bahamas, one also favored by Meyer Lansky and Robert Vesco. Tom Forcade broke off from the Yippies and Zippies to join forces with Hunter S. Thompson, whose gonzo career had just been launched by Hinkle, now editor of Scanlon's magazine. Thompson decided to run for sheriff on a freak power platform. One of his friends, having just read the first Gonzo story on the Kentucky Derby, suggested he should travel around and shit on everything American. The Super Bowl, Times Square New Year's, Mardi Gras, the Masters Cup, the Miss America pageant, and the America's Cup in Newport, Rhode Island, which was coming up. Hunter consulted Warren Hinkle, who immediately said yes. Hunter secured a 3-masted schooner with diesel engine and ran up the Jolly Roger. He began motoring around the harbor, practicing for an invasion into the race. Forcade, Peel, and a recent graduate from Yale named Ron Rosenbaum, who later became closely connected to the head of CIA counterintelligence, all boarded as his pirate crew. Peel brought along his punk band, the Lower East Side, some of whom may have served other functions, although Peel would remain closeted his entire life and never got on board with the Gay Liberation Front. He was older than the people around him and had come to New York City after serving in the Army. Wherever the pirate boat went, it was cheered on by the Kashmir and Gin crowd on the docks, as they were the only live entertainment in the harbor. Tom's ear-shattering Minutemen speakers were on board, and they opened their sets with "Up Against the Wall, motherfuckers!" a chant inspired by an anarchist in the East Village named Ben Maria, whose girlfriend would soon shoot Andy Warhol. Acts of violence had long been an essential part of Maria's wheelhouse, and there was suspicion in some quarters about whether he might be an intelligence operative, although he claimed to be an artist and devoted Dadaist. Maria was head of a street gang called the Motherfuckers, who specialized in shaking down concert promoters and ripping off those they felt weren't sharing enough with the people. After 3 days and nights of this tatty crew assembled in a crowded berth, Forcade and his entourage departed for New York, a great relief to Thompson. The night before the race, while tripping, Hunter and his artist sidekick finally took action in the dead of night, boarded their rowboat dinghy, and slipped into the forbidden zone near the Intrepid with the intent of spray painting "Fuck the Pope" on its side, to be captured by the film crews the next day during the race. Unfortunately for them, they were caught in the act by one of the crew, who demanded to know why they had entered the forbidden zone. Thompson panicked and frantically rowed back to the dock while setting off 2 emergency flares to cover his exit from the area, hoping the local sheriff wasn't tailing him back to Aspen.
The first time he opened up Bobby's. Bobby's was his dealing complex.
It was like a whorehouse. It was like all, you know, without beds. It was like a bunch of different cubicles. And the woman would come in wheeling a cart with all different kinds of marijuana.
He shows me the 6 rooms, each with like a couch, a chair, and a table full of magazines. And, you know, he could handle a lot of people at once.
Forcade suspected this guy, John Wynett, of tipping off some black dudes that held up his smoke easy. So Forcade, this guy used to like to wear platform shoes. So Forcade got a bunch of platform shoes and put them in a whole barrel of cement, you know, and was going to kill this guy and take him down and throw him in the fucking river in cement platform shoes.
Abby and Tom got into a fight over Steal This Book. And at the time I was working with Abby on Steal This Book, I was sort of his fulfillment manager. People would send in checks and we'd send back the book. I liked Abby, he was an interesting guy, but I was also close to Tom, and I was very pissed off that the two of them were fighting. I was sort of in the middle. So I said, why don't you guys work this out? They said no. I said, well, I'll tell you what, we'll create a counterculture court.
I say quite honestly, Forcade's labors are worth not more than $500, and perhaps even less.
So then they used all my corrections of the first thing, which, you know, were necessary, because this manuscript, I mean, this thing that they had represented the only true copy.
And I functioned as the bailiff, that is, entering evidence and, you know, bringing in witnesses, and that's sort of balancing the whole thing. And of course, the New York Times did this story, and they also did an editorial criticizing us for being outside the legal system, but really it was modeled on the old Jewish Sanhedrin courts, which existed in the Middle Ages. Anyway, so we gave that a try, and it didn't work out.
When it was over, Abby was deliriously happy. Tom refused to shake his hand.
Right.
Tom came out and announced that he had won because he'd won a $500 judgment to save face. Abby never paid the $500.
Right.
They both released their own copies of the book.
Yes.
So the whole thing...
It didn't work out.
When Mark Rudd was demonstrating outside my school window at a Columbia University building for SDS, and I thought, oh my gosh, there's something going on out there. It was wonderful to discover this whole bunch of people. It was also the same time we invaded Cambodia as a country, and we had Nixon as president, and it was horrifying to me that students were shot on Kent State campus, and that I think propelled me. That, along with meeting Tom, you know, he had a white hat and a black hat. He was wearing the black hat. He was usually wearing the black hat. Doesn't mean he was a bad guy. He just liked his hat, his black hat, and well, he was a character unlike any I'd known. I started to work on the Underground Press Syndicate. He said, "Come on down and see UPS on West 10th Street," and I did, and you know, I just started working there. And there I met John Wilcock and many people after that, of course, because it led right into 1971, led right into the national conventions. They were both in Miami in 1972.
This was all leading up to Miami. Basically what I was saying is that, you know, if everyone was saying that be clean for Gene and the whole McGovern thing was what was happening, they were missing the point. There were still a bunch of us who were outside the system. We didn't agree with the system was corrupt, and I cited the Yippies as an example of, you know, uncompromising political stance.
At the same time, I also met Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin and Ed Sanders and all these other people. And so I was becoming affiliated with the Yippies in the daytime, and Tom doing his mysterious stuff. I mean, I had no idea he had started something called the Yippies, and it was really antithetical toward the Yippies, and it was a big sore point. So I found myself in the middle of a real, you know, Abby and Jerry were not happy about the Yippies, and I was kind of pissed at Tom because he never told me about the Yippies, so he expected me to be a Zippy, but meanwhile, I was on board with the Yippies.
That was about the time I had met Aaron Kay. He was working for a group called Green Power. This was in Los Angeles. Green Power was an organization that fed people at demonstrations. And Aaron was their chief fundraiser. He was not a pie thrower yet. He was not a Yippie yet. As he would take a can and he would go to all the rock concerts, and he would hit people up that were standing in line for coins, and that's how they kept the program going. At that point, they were going to have the Republican convention in San Diego, and at the last minute, they moved it to Miami. The story that we got was that they had planned to do some major disruption and blame it on the anti-war movement and declare martial law. There was a book written about that called the Glass House Tapes, and there was this informer turned double agent named Louis Tackwood that blew the cover off the whole thing, and I don't know if that's ever been proven, but I know that the Yippies were publishing a lot of information about that in the paper, published in Madison. So I started hitchhiking, and I got a ride from a draft dodger named Cal, and they'd just been to his house while he was at work, and his girlfriend called him, so he figured it was time for him to get out of LA so he wouldn't get arrested. And he was driving back to Austin, Texas, so I figured, what the heck, you know, may as well go to Austin, Texas. So we were driving to Austin, Texas, and I think we were like at the New Mexico-Texas border, and we saw this big hulking figure hitchhiking, kind of scary looking guy with a lot of hair. And as soon as we got him in the headlights, I realized it was Aaron, so we picked him up. I said, pick that guy up, he's a friend of mine. So we got Aaron in the car, and I go, Aaron, where are you going? He says, well, I'm going out to Miami to, to feed people at the Democratic National Convention. When I got to Miami, I was just kind of, lost in all the urban traffic, and I didn't really know where people were and what was going on. And I got picked up by this other guy named Red. He was driving this little Austin Healey, and he goes, where are you going? I said, well, I'm coming out here for the protest. What are you doing? He says, well, I'm with the Yippies, and I'm staying over at the house on Mary Street, and I'm just out here looking for a part for my car. And he said he had to look, he needed to look around for the part a little bit, but when he found it, he could take me back to the Mary Street house, and I could probably crash there. So as it turned out, I had a little money on me, and he didn't have enough money for the part, so I helped him buy it. It was a water pump, and he didn't know how to put it in, so I put it in for him. And so by this time, we developed a little bit of a friendship, so he took me over to the Mary Street house and introduced me to all the Yippies over there. There were Dana Beale and Tom Forcade and A.J. Weatherman and Vinegar Bin Zippy and all these guys. And I'd never heard of them before. And so I just started hanging around the house and working in the kitchen and helping. They were putting out a daily newspaper about the conventions, and I was helping lay that out. And so when we got everybody camping in Flamingo Park, which was where all the demonstrators were, for some reason they gave us a camping permit.
What was it like meeting Forcade first off?
Well, he was just kind of this guy that was walking around and always grumbling about stuff, and I wasn't paying that much attention to him. Mostly I was working with Dana. It was obviously it was obvious that he was somebody that carried some weight around there. People seemed to defer to him a lot. Him and Dana seemed to run all the meetings, and whatever they wanted to be decided, that was usually what got decided. His big thing was talking about cultural imperialism, and he was talking about Coca-Cola and all these multinationals going into other countries and destroying their culture really before anyone else that I knew of, and that was something he was really concerned about. And so we all made sure that we didn't buy anything and that was made by these big companies, and we weren't allowed to drink beer. But they didn't drink much, but they took a lot of LSD. About the only other drug that was used besides marijuana. Of course, I'd already taken a lot of acid, so I did a lot of trips with these guys. And then they were having a big meeting one day in the Flamingo Park, so I went out to the meeting, and they were dividing up all the tasks that had to be done. And one of the things that needed to be done was this one guy had been working on this 20-foot piñata shaped like a joint. And he had started it, and then he just kind of quit, and they didn't know what happened to him. And so I volunteered to help finish the paper mache job on the joint. I'd done some paper mache before, so that was my first job, really.
Through the long morning and deep into the afternoon, one young radical after another, leaders not seen before demonstrations and longtime anti-war protesters such as Rennie Davis, urged their colleagues to action. The goal tonight is as much peaceful disruption and voluntary arrests as possible. But outside of the police, two other factors are working against the demonstrators. One is nature, the other is philosophy. The nights are long, and during the day it's miserably hot in the park. Day after day of protesting is hard work, and the sleeping accommodations are earthy at best. Philosophically, it may appear that these young people are united as one and will move as one. They will not. Some are even pulling out. Others have deep reservations about the evening.
It's not the question of arrest, it's the question to me of violence or nonviolence. I came down here to protest the war, and I'm against violence completely, and I can't see how we can protest violence. And then some people, which are going to go over there and try to start hassles and break things.
Another early contingent has arrived here in front of Convention Hall. Before the night's over, all the protesters expect to be here in the convention area, some looking to get arrested, others not. Either way, the police say they're amply prepared, as ABC's Lynn Tucker reports.
While many of the demonstrators slept, police were getting ready. First, to help keep the protesters at a distance, they built a wall of buses around most of Convention Hall. By noon, thousands of officers were reporting for duty. The inside of the main entrance will be protected by more than 1,500 Miami and Miami Beach policemen. Sheriff's deputies will help handle some of the side entrances. Florida Highway Patrolmen, with help from other agencies, will be ready to take to the streets to make sure this convention is not disrupted. Some shopkeepers have already protected against the possibility of trouble. Any crowd near the hall will be thoroughly infiltrated with Secret Service, FBI, and other plainclothes agents. There'll be no attempt to hide their presence because the emphasis here is on a massive show of force. And if all the immediately available force can't handle things, 2,000 National Guardsmen will be ready at a nearby high school. And 20 miles away, 2,500 Marines and paratroopers are ready. All this force is here to make sure it is safe for the president to come to Convention Hall tonight.
As a press person inside the convention with Unicorn News, which was an alternative news service that we had started, a radical news service. But I remember, the most vivid outside thing I remember was one of the most upsetting things that I can remember from that time, was going to Flamingo Park and watching Dana Beale giving everyone LSD that was there, and then doing classic brainwashing technique. This was the Yippies, you know, because they've been rejected by the Yippies. They were now the Yippies. And, you know...
Well, the Yippies were going to work with the anti-war Democrats.
Yes.
The Yippies wanted to blow everything up.
Yeah.
But it was the Waterloo of the movement.
Well, I'm telling you, I was at Flamingo Park watching this. I've never heard anyone talk about this the way I'm going to talk to you. Maybe someone else has. I hope someone else had the same feelings I had. I saw a classic brainwashing technique going on over a course of 6 to 8 hours, with people that had all been given very high doses of LSD. And that, to me, is the exact opposite of what LSD was supposed to do.
And what was the purpose of the brainwashing? What was the
I think it was basically to get them to do what Dana and whoever else was with Dana, to follow them as against time.
Well, there was a long-standing rumor that was originally spread by Allen Ginsberg, which he later retracted, that Tom was a narc and an informant. And a lot of this started in Miami at the convention. There were flyers later found to be spread by the FBI accusing Tom Forcade of being a drug pusher, a heroin addict, and all kinds of other horrible things.
All these radical heavy hitters rented a room at the Fontainebleau in Miami, and they were gonna instigate some sort of incident that would turn the 72 Republican convention into a remake of the 68 Democratic convention in Chicago. There were riots in the streets and all this political crap going on. But for some reason they all showed up at the suite in the Fontainebleau, which overnight was flooded with free methaqualone, Quaaludes. And nobody had heard about Quaaludes. I had not heard about Quaaludes before then. And everybody just kind of sat around and apparently did Quaaludes. I was in New York, but from what I heard, everybody just sat around and got blissed out completely on Quaaludes.
I met Tom in 1972 at the Democratic National Convention. I was trying to score some pot in the People's Pot Park, or something they called People's Park, I think they called it at the time. And I was directed to go to a corner of the park where there was a tree, literally, and up in the tree was a guy named Tom Forcade. I didn't know his name at the time, but he was literally selling marijuana out of this goddamn pot tree. And at the time, frankly, I didn't think much about it. I mean, I just thought, well, there's an interesting guy sold me pot from a tree.
The police picked them up on a basis that they had a kerosene can in the back of the van, and they had some wires on the floor someplace in the van, and they accused him of having a bomb.
It was a can of kerosene with a bomb underneath, and the thing is that
it was a real bomb.
There was and there were some big posters, the big portraits taken from the convention center and left on the roof of the place in Coconut Grove, and all kinds of the piss in, the crazy stuff that went on there. It was hilarious. But mostly, if you want to talk about the Waterloo of the movement, yes, you had people like Ed Sanders, Abby, and Jerry in hotel rooms in relative comfort, trying to push the Democratic agenda, which they saw as urgent in order to end the war and so on. And they had a point. But the culture war, the gap was way too wide at that time, and it was not a time to compromise. If anything, it was a time to be even more outrageous.
But anyway, down there, he was clever enough to construct a bomb that was impossible for the FBI to determine whether it was a bomb or a candle. Forcade put out Beach Blanket News with the money that we got from John and Yoko. And, he just went around and got people together. And
Well, there was a riot on Miami Beach.
yeah, there was a riot during the Republican convention.
Right.
Absolutely.
How did that riot start?
It just, everybody knew the last night Nixon got the nomination again, and people just started, slashing cops' tires and trashing the fucking place, basically. So the cops came to the Zippy house, and they arrested. Forcade was arrested for the bombing thing, and held him in, without bail for some time. And he told me that the FBI agents came around and asked him. First of all, they had, the FBI agents were stationed in front of his fucking cell because he said the Weather Underground is going to break me out, And they came and, they held a gun on me, automatic pistol. And they had a little conversation whether they should beat me up or not because my cousin was a big rabbi in Miami Beach. But they decided that it was okay to beat me up. So they started kicking my ribs in and shit. And then they said, you guys got, 10 minutes to leave. And they slashed the tires on our car. But we got the new tires and got out of there. And it was, sure was glad to get out of there alive,
One day, we read in the New York Times about a boat that was leaving to cruise down the coast to Cape Canaveral to watch the last Apollo moon launch. And on board were a lot of celebrities, a lot of NASA scientists, top science fiction writers, and a lot of press freeloading. So Tom had this idea that it was some kind of secret plot. Rich people were conspiring to leave this Earth behind that they had ruined and colonize the moon and the other planets. And this was actually a secret seminar. It was a cover for this. And we're sitting around smoking dope and getting all upset about it. And he says, fuck it, we're the underground press. We should be on there. We should be represented. And I said, fuck yeah. So, we found out what dock it was at. We got, I think, Gabrielle, my girlfriend. Oh, he was with Cindy at the time. Cindy was wearing her trademark Girl Scout brownie outfit, and we had a whole bunch of friends. We had a going away party on the boat. We had an ounce of dope with us, and we stole the keys to a splendid stateroom right on the top, right next to the captain. And then we said goodbye to our friends, and away went the boat. We watched the New York Harbor retreat, and suddenly we looked at it and said, holy fuck, we're stowing away on a ship. This is a felony. Well, it wasn't the first felony either of us committed. But on board were people like Norman Mailer, Hugh Downs, Catherine Ann Porter, Ship of Fools, Robert Heinlein, a whole gaggle of celebrities, and basically an empty boat except for these few people. So Tom and I were stowaways on the voyage beyond Apollo. We became friends with Norman and actually smoked some dope with him and Hugh Downs, watching one of the first and only night launches of an Apollo moonshot. What I didn't know about Tom was that he was a serious fucking manic depressive. And so we'd gotten on the boat, we smoked our dope, that was nice. but he was on medication at the time, and he didn't bring his pills. But he did bring other pills. He had a pocket full of pills, ups, downs, and everything. What happened was, somewhere after the launch, there were a couple of days when this story came out and they chased us around the boat. We had to hide, you know. They never caught us. He sank into the worst depression I'd ever seen. He was almost comatose. I had to drag him around the ship and stuff him in rope lockers and things to like keep him from being discovered. And meanwhile, the crew was running around looking for us because the story had come out in the Times. I had to roll him practically down the gangplank to get him off the ship in St. Thomas, and then I stashed him away at the University of the Virgin Islands while I went and found a plane to get us. He was practically comatose, and he was going to throw himself off the ship at some point. I really got to witness someone in the depths of manic depression on the low side.
You might think Washington, D.C. think tanks are conservative by nature, but the first one created is decidedly leftist. The Institute for Policy Studies, IPS, founded by former concert pianist Marcus Raskin and Boston lawyer Richard Barnett in 1963. Strangely, Raskin was an aide to McGeorge Bundy, while Barnett worked for John J. McCloy in the State Department. You'd be hard-pressed to find two more well-connected members of the oligarchy than Bundy and McCloy. Bundy was the bonesman offspring of two powerful Boston Brahmin clans who rose to head the CIA-connected Ford Foundation. He was an intelligence officer during World War II and afterwards co-wrote bonesman Henry Stimson's autobiography. In 1949, he was appointed Secretary of the powerful Council on Foreign Relations and began having private meetings with General Dwight Eisenhower, who would soon be president, and Allen Dulles, who Eisenhower would put in charge of intelligence operations. These meetings no doubt involved David Rockefeller, who would soon chair a committee to completely reorganize the government. In 1954, Rockefeller was made Special Assistant on Psychological War, and the following year he created the Planning Coordination Group for running covert counterintelligence responses to national security issues. McCloy served as head of the World Bank and became a member of the highly sensitive Warren Commission. Before World War II, McCloy was North American attorney for I.G. Farben, largest corporation in Europe, and after the war he was Bonesman Stimson's aide when Stimson devised the Black Eagle Fund and disappeared billions in Nazi and Japanese stolen gold, which was divvied up into hundreds of secret funds and banks around the world, while dividends and interest used to topple democracies unfavorable to Wall Street interests, while fomenting right and left-wing terror squads to drive the dialectical confrontations. The U.S. military headquarters was set up inside Farben's massive complex, which strangely was never bombed during the war, even though it represented the nerve center of Germany's industrial and chemical operations, perhaps due to the close relations between Farben and Rockefeller's Standard Oil, companies that did business throughout the war. Farben quickly became Hitler's biggest corporate booster and financial sponsor, while its in-house intelligence network became the brains behind the SS and Gestapo. In fact, Farben had been the brainchild of John Foster Dulles, Eisenhower's Secretary of State, and Dulles helped design the immense complex housing over 200,000 workers. McCloy was put in charge of Germany and swiftly pardoned any Nazis they wanted recruited. Now, what are the odds aides of these immensely powerful insiders whose families were longtime Republicans would create a center of energy on radical activity in America? Whenever I find operations like this, I suspect spooks at work. Funding for IPS came from two sources: Philip Stern, heir to the Sears fortune in Chicago, and banker James Warburg, whose father designed the Federal Reserve, a privately held banking cartel that rules our money supply and sets interest rates. These deep connections indicate IPS was no accidental grassroots emanation, but a conscious construction of a system it was designed to attack, which is standard spook operational procedure, because if there's going to be something attacking you, it's best if you secretly manipulate it so there's no unintended harm to your bottom line. I suspect IPS appeared shortly after the Students for a Democratic Society released the Port Huron Statement because SDS was gathering momentum quickly and threatening a socialist youth revolt. However, by 1969, SDS was shattered by internal divisions fomented by undercover agents, while its center of energy was stolen by a small group of fanatics who supported terror tactics and murder. They called themselves the Weathermen after a Bob Dylan song, and they were funded by IPS. The Weathermen destroyed the student youth movement by driving it off a cliff. I was right there, says Patty Astor. SDS was really gathering steam and poised to become a real force, and the Weather Underground blew the whole thing to shit. It was a serious, almost like a body-snatching scenario where one day everything was fine, and the next, people you knew were screaming about getting in cells and tons of crazy shit. The true leaders of the Weather Underground were Bernardine Dorn and Bill Ayers. Ayers' father was immensely wealthy. He was CEO of Commonwealth Edison and sat on many boards, including Sears's, where he likely would have been seated next to IPS sugar daddy Philip Stern. Dorn also had a privileged upbringing in Minneapolis and ended up at the Rockefeller-funded University of Chicago Law School, where she became the first student organizer for the communist-infested National Lawyers Guild. In fact, IPS was run by Yale Law School grad Peter Weiss, an Austrian-born lawyer and prominent leader inside the National Lawyers Guild, although his wife Cora also seems to have played a prominent role. Although they deny it today, Dorn and Ayers were the most bloodthirsty instigators and always ready to up the stakes. Dorn's most famous quote came at the Wargasm they organized in Flint, Michigan. In reference to the recent murder of Sharon Tate, she announced, "First they killed those pigs, then they ate dinner in the same room with them, then they even shoved a fork into Pig Tate's stomach. Wild." In homage to Hitler, she created a three-fingered fork salute. They painted Manson as culture hero and role model. When Timothy Leary was busted in California and jailed for 10 years for possessing 2 joints, President Richard Nixon already considered him the most dangerous man in America. Leary was a brilliant psychologist and designed a personality profile quiz he was forced to take when he checked into prison. The problem with Leary, however, is that he was already blanketed by spooks when he arrived in California. The Weathermen seized on his incarceration as an opportunity to bust Leary out and whisk him to Africa, and they employed the escape as a publicity stunt to enhance their visibility. Dorn wore a button on her blouse. Cunnilingus is cool, fellatio is fun, while showing off massive cleavage. Steve Tapas requested she button up, and she responded by pulling out a breast. "You like this tit?" she said. "Take it." Eventually, participation in group orgies became compulsory inside the Weather Underground, resulting in widespread genital infections known as weather crud. In this regard, they resembled the Process Church of Final Judgment, who also deployed drugs and sex games to reprogram the flock. On February 12, 1970, 2 bombs went off in the Berkeley Police Station parking lot during a shift change, allegedly to maximize the death count, yet thankfully no officers were killed. But 4 days later, another bomb went off during a shift change at a station in San Francisco, and this one did succeed in murdering an innocent officer. Isn't it strange that when Leary was captured and brought back to prison with his sentence greatly enhanced, he caved and told everything he knew about the Weathermen, had broken him out of jail and whisked him to Africa with a fake passport. Funny though, nothing came of his confession, not a single arrest nor interrogation. Bizarre, considering the Weathermen are supposed to be the FBI's #1 target. It gets even stranger because Ayers and Dorn eventually became tenured professors in Chicago, holding down high-paying gigs at major universities. It's unfathomable how 2 terrorists on the most wanted list could live a life on the lam for over a decade and then emerge in 1980 and serve no jail time. In fact, Dorn almost immediately got a gig with the most prestigious law firm in Chicago, the same one that hired Obama and Michelle. Most charges against the Weathermen had already been dropped. This is the opposite of what happens when cop killers come to court. The most prominent spokesman for IPS is Noam Chomsky, who is a 9/11 conspiracy denier who faithfully supports the official cover story. In fact, Chomsky claims the reason he knows 9/11 wasn't an inside job is because if it had been, the hijackers would have been sheep-dipped as Iraqi and not Saudi. This position makes zero sense and ignores the close personal relationship between Bonesman Bush family and the ruling Saudi royal houses. The other primary supporter of the official story in the media is John Foster Chip Burleigh, who used to oversee a propaganda network funded through the Ford Foundation. Burley was also a prominent figure inside the National Lawyers Guild, as well as the CIA-sponsored National Student Association. And Burley was apparently an undercover FBI informant in Chicago for a time, and he seems to have some sort of relationship with the Mossad, because he frequently appears in the media as an expert on their operations. Burley's stockbrother father, Colonel George Numa Burley Jr., named his son after John Foster Dulles, former Secretary of State and head of the most powerful law firm in America, Sullivan and Cromwell. It was John Foster Dulles who created IG Farben by convincing 6 German corporations to merge, and as bait, Dulles arranged huge loans from Wall Street to seal the deal. Farben was designed largely to mimic operations of Standard Oil, which became a major investor in Farben, joining Max Warburg and the DuPonts. Today, Burley has become a leader in helping foment a new inquisition, which brands political heretics as lunatics deserving incarceration and forced medication, simply for not accepting the official stories on 9/11 and the JFK assassination. He dubbed this imaginary mental disorder as conspiracism. The IPS works hand in glove with the oldest magazine in America, The Nation, run by Katrina Vanden Heuvel, who sits on the IPS board and is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Her father, William Vanden Heuvel, was a protege of William Donovan, who headed the Office of Strategic Services, precursor of the CIA. Even more telling, Vanden Heuvel was the personal attorney for Bonesman W.A. Harriman. Maybe you can see the incredible tight-knit relationship between all these characters, and why I suspect staged confrontations and propaganda psyops are in play. This is the real world, a spook-infested wilderness of mirrors where up is down and black is white.
Some folks know about it, some don't. Some will learn to shout it, some won't. But sooner or later, baby, here's a wiki saying you're gonna have to get right down to the real sticky icky. Let's get right down to the real sticky icky now. 1, 2, sticky icky now, yeah.
I think the next time I ran into Forcade was at the inauguration of Richard Nixon, which at this point they figured that since the last place I had been was Texas, that I was Mike from Texas, because I had to be from somewhere, and that they wanted me to be the representative for Texas Yippies, because there wasn't a lot of Texas Yippies, I guess. There was a few. And so they wanted me to come up to the meeting where they were organizing the convention, and that's, you know, the same crowd was up there. And so they decided to send me to Washington, D.C., the first person to help organize the convention. And they'd given me this address of a guy that was supposedly someplace I could crash. As it turned out, it was just a guy that had been up hitchhiking. And he let me stay there one night, but that was like pretty much it. And so I didn't have a place to stay. I didn't have any money. And Dana wants me to, he had this idea to build a large rat float with Nixon's face on it that we would attempt to get into the inaugural parade. And I remember when he called me on the phone about how I liked the idea. I said, well, it sounds like a really dumb idea to me. He goes, well, everybody else really likes the idea. And then I think what he did when he hung up was we called other people and said, well, Mike really likes the idea. And pretty soon he had everybody agreeing that everybody else liked the idea. But nobody knew what it was supposed to look like or how it was going to be made. So my job is to try to start scamming materials and money to build this thing. And we finally found some hippies commune down on, I think it was Delaware Street, right behind the train station. And they were a bunch of, commies with, linen posters in the dining room and all kinds of lists of what people were supposed to be doing around the house. And so that was my headquarters for starting to build the float, but I didn't have any money and I wasn't getting any real support from the other Yippies, and they hadn't come to town yet. And then about 3 days before the inauguration, everybody starts showing up, and finally Dana comes up with $500, and we find somebody that's got a van, and so we go to the hardware store and we buy a bunch of chicken wire and some 2x4s and some little wheels that look like they go on a small lawnmower. And we started building the float, and I was getting really tired, so Dana figures, well, the best thing to do is to take a little acid and it'll keep you going. So I did. So we spent all night building this float on acid, and It actually didn't turn out looking too bad. And we didn't have a parade permit because the police wouldn't give us one, because I think the last time the Yippies had a parade permit, they had a little riot or something just before my time. But I just know that they had decided to use the SDS parade route directly before the SDS used it. And it went down to one of the spots along the parade, the inaugural parade, where there would be a police barricade, but there's also all kinds of bleachers, and people were standing there waiting to catch the inaugural parade. And that was our whole point. We were going to take the rat down there, and then we're going to bust through the police line, and we were going to join the parade. And we had not only the rat float with Nixon's face on it, but Grimes Posnikoff, I don't know if you know him, he's the human jukebox. You can still see him down in Fisherman's Wharf. He lives in a little box, and if you put money in it, he jumps out and plays the trumpet. But he had brought 500 Mouseketeer hats. Again, I think this was Dana's idea. So we had like 500 people with Mouseketeer hats playing kazoos in front of the rat. But anyway, the night before, when we're still building it, the SDS guys come over and with all their tough guys and leather jackets and stuff, and said, look, if you guys try to go over to our parade route, we got a bunch of karate experts, and we're going to work you guys over. And of course, we're really, really high at this point, so we just laugh at them. And, they weren't like the old SDS, the really hardcores had split off into the Weather Underground. And these guys were all from the Progressive Labor Party. They were a bunch of intellectual wankers. And they just didn't like the counterculture. They didn't approve of drug use. They thought it was bourgeois decadence and all that sort of thing, that we were counter-revolutionaries, and they called us a lot of other names too. So anyway, it started raining that night, and the rat started to dissolve, and so we kept trying to put more paper on it. And finally, a warm wind came out like 2 hours before we're supposed to leave, and dries the whole float off. And we're painting it as we're trying to haul it out of the alleyway, and it's so big that it's actually rubbing on gutter pipes and stuff, and we're having to constantly touch up the paint. And we get out to our parade route. It was a really narrow alleyway back there. We had built it behind this house, but we hadn't measured the alley, and it was actually too big to get out.
How big was this rat?
Oh, it's bigger than this motel room. It was huge.
Right.
That was the whole point. And so we kind of squeezed it out there onto the street, and it was about 40 hours max, and we were up the whole time on acid. So we finally get it out in the street, and all the Yippies assemble, and then the cops, are onto us by now. And the only thing they're really concerned about is you could fit about 30 people inside this rat, and they just wanted to make sure there wasn't anybody inside. And we were really shocked that we hadn't thought of that, because that would have been cool. But anyway, so we got onto the SDS parade route, and nobody stopped us, and then we marched towards the inaugural parade route. And then we encountered our line of cops, and there was quite a few cops there, and they're all, in their riot gear. And so we started to push forward. Everybody gets forward right next to the police line, and everybody gets behind them, and you just kind of do the push forward thing to see if you could break through. And then they figured that out, what we were trying to do, so they sent in their little motorcycle squad. Yeah, there's about 1,000 of us now. We picked up a bunch of hippies on the way, and so they figured out what we were trying to do, and figured they weren't going to let us do it, so they surrounded us with the little motor scooter, and then they started clubbing us, and we all dispersed, and they grabbed the rat, and they called in this big flatbed truck, and they put the rat on the flatbed truck and drove away. And we were kind of all dejected. This was the end of our little party, and we were going to go down to the Washington Monument, where the Vietnam veterans were demonstrating, and there was really kind of a big gathering going on. And as we were walking down there, we noticed this flatbed truck is stuck in traffic, and it doesn't have any police escorts. So we went over and stopped the truck. We grab our rat back. It's on the flatbed, and so we just run over and grab it off the flatbed. We stop the truck and tell them not to move it, and then we unlashed it. And we got the rat off, and now we're running with it. We're holding it in the air. And it's much more mobile that way than on these tiny little wheels that we had. And so we go, okay, we're going back to the parade route. And this time, we're running. And so we're about 500 of us. We're still wearing our Mickey Mouse hats. And we take just a plunge into the police line with the rat. And of course, we get repelled and clubbed, and you know, pushed around. And this time they take the rat and they start beating it, and you know, they're hitting Nixon in the face, and it's actually pretty funny. Nixon, I mean, he's kind of easy with that nose and those jowls.
We were having a party up at our loft, up at the Commune on Vestry Street. And Sunshine had just come into town. So we were all tripping on Sunshine. We were sitting on the floor with our backs against the couch. And we were pretty high, and all of a sudden Tom sits up. I thought Tom was having a bad trip. I said to him, what's the matter, Tom, you okay? He said, wow, I just had an idea. I said, what's that? He said, what do people want more than drugs? I said, I don't know, money? But I don't even think money, because people are paying money for drugs. And he said, no, more than money, more than drugs. What do people want? I said, I don't know, I don't have a clue, all right? He said, they want information about drugs. I said, okay. He said, no, where to get them, how to know if they're, the purity of the drugs you're getting, how to produce better drugs. And I said to him, okay. And he said, I'm going to start a magazine, and I'm going to make a lot of money selling people information about drugs. I said, Tom, you just made $2 million selling hash. What makes you think a magazine you're going to make more money?
He would keep a tank of nitrous oxide and be sucking on balloons. We'd be sharing balloons, and as he was working on the first issue, and he'd show me, look what we're doing this, look what do you think of this idea and this idea. And then the first issue came out, and they had a party down at the Fifth Avenue Hotel, a press party with people from the New York Times, Time Magazine, AP, everybody, Al Goldstein from Screw. And Tom asked me to help talk to the press because he felt that I presented the right image for that sort of thing. And I said, but I really had nothing much to do with it. He said, hey, you know as much about this as anybody. And that was my first job for High Times. And then he asked me to help him do the business end of things. And at first, of course, we were all afraid to put our name on the masthead, because we didn't know if it was legal to shoot pictures of dope. Nobody had really ever done it before.
Yeah, people are going to look at pictures of weed. Duh. He comes by one day and says, give me some pictures. And I lay out a whole bunch of pictures, and he takes out like a dozen, and he publishes them. And then he comes back again and goes, you know, everybody just says the pictures were the greatest thing in the magazine, so. And then unfortunately, he went out and hired himself Bob Guccione's centerfold picture editor.
Tom was at heart just sort of a very bright, ambitious kid who loved engines, guns, and he loved tweaking authority.
The first issue of High Times appeared in 1974. Over the next 5 years, circulation shot up like a rocket, and Tom's biggest problem was dealing with the unbelievable overnight success that the magazine achieved.
The first issue went out totally through pot dealers. And then he came by and he said he was all bummed out because no distributors would distribute. He printed the first issue of High Times, and no distributors would distribute it. And he was bummed out. He said, you know, I put all this money into this magazine, no distributors would distribute it. He said, I don't know what I'm going to do. I got all these copies of High Times. I told him, Tom, you got the best distribution network in the world. I said, all you got to do is go to all the dealers you know and give them a copy of High Times, and every time they sell a pound, put a copy of High Times in it.
And I'll never forget, as it came off press, Tom walking into my office with that first color issue and saying, this is a license to print money. He was excited.
High Times was like a weird place. It was mysterious because you always, you know, I mean, since it was so outside the law, you always wondered, like, who is this person really? Tom was just one of those people that, like, he was sort of mythic, and you know, I mean, I still don't know what, you know, what's real and what's not, you know. But I think he liked it that way. He was hard to read, you know. He was like, I mean, as I got to know him, I realized that that was all, you know, a lot of it was an act, you know. He was deliberately, like, opaque and contradictory, and but I thought he was smart, and I mean, you know, I liked him because he was funny.
And he had all these great parties where we'd have laughing gas and stuff, you know. So it was cool. Forcade was like, he was pretty fucking amazing guy.
Tom was a funny guy. I really liked Tom, you know. How to describe it's very hard to describe Tom. He was, you know, he was a doer. He believed in what he was doing. That's the best thing I can say about Tom. Tom, you know, one time I called him Tom Forcade, right, which most people call him now, and he said to me, "Do you know what a facade is? A facade is a phony front, and there ain't nothing phony about me." And he said, well, what did he call himself? Tom Forcade. He said, "I'm Tom Forcade." With all of us back at that time, it wasn't about the money. It was about changing the world.
Jack was a good friend. The three of us hung out together all the time. We would fly to Florida frequently. We'd go to, you know, I don't know what they were doing, those two. I mean, they were probably doing things with marijuana. But the fact is, I would stay at the pool at the Mutiny Hotel or something in Miami, Coconut Grove, and I would just work on my tan and swim and drink pina coladas. And I was protected from the information. And Tom and I weren't married at that exact time. But even when I was married to Tom, and there would have been some protection, spousal protection for me knowing anything. I mean, he still didn't, you know, I still didn't know any real, I knew details, but I didn't know what they were actually doing.
And he came with this very large, tough-looking friend, and it looked like Mutton Jeff. His friend was strong, very good-looking, and was almost like a bodyguard. And Jack was extremely likable, and he must have been fascinated by Tom because he really was so loyal to Tom that I felt good that he had a friend that cared so much about him and looked out for him.
Jack, when he was with Leslie Bacon, they were part of Tom's sort of commune, his tribe. What was it? I forget what
Free Ranger tribe.
Free Ranger tribe. That was on 17th Street. That's where they had the teepee and the desks and offices. And he was a sweet guy, and he was definitely not from New York. I mean, he was practically a farm boy. And I didn't know what the hell he was doing in our scene. You know, he was just a nice guy.
So I meet Tom, and I go into his office, and it was at 116 East 27th Street. And his window, he was on the 6th floor, and the window that he had looked out to the Chrysler building. So he was sitting there in front of the window. And I learned that was sort of a power thing, to put yourself in front of a window so that the light was behind you and no one could see your face. Tom was so theatrical. So I go in to meet, I sit down, and the chair that Tom puts me in for the interview has me sitting probably like this to him at the desk. And he's a little guy, and I'm just 4'10" and a half. So, and Tom was maybe 5'5", 5'6", something like that, but a thin little wisp of a man. And he sat me down, and on one side of his desk was this beautiful Coke scale, brass, with the little brass measuring. And in his other hand, he had a tie stick, and he kept twirling the tie stick through the entire interview. And at one point, he asked me about my background, asked me about my, typing skills, and basically said, well, the girls told me that, you were pretty good, and so I just need to know a little bit more. And he goes, there's we use drugs here, and he said, how do you feel about that? And I said, well, I do it as often as I can. And I don't think there's any other interview, Steve, that I ever could have won by saying, do you mind drugs? And I go, no, I do them as often as I can. And I got the job. When Tom and I went to Los Angeles after he found the film The Smugglers by Jim West, and he purchased it from Jim, I think he paid $50,000 for the film, and then he proceeded to put another $100,000 into it with Lech Kowalski as editor. And this was his new thing. He was going to get into films.
The first time I met Tom Forcade, he walked into the offices of Punk magazine, past our secretary, pushed his way through, sat down next to me, put his feet on the desk in front of me so I couldn't get any work done, got my attention, looked me in the eye and said, I'm going to make you rich and famous.
I first met Tom Forcade in 1977 and at High Times office, and I told him to put Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols on the cover of the magazine. If he did, the magazine would sell out. He did, it did, and I was hooked. Tom was an instant person. You don't get many people who make decisions that quickly and actually carry them out.
I thought Tom's interest in the punk movement was really right on. It was great. That was the direction to go. But I think that the magazine wanted his attention. They wanted his focus. It needed Tom to be there, and he didn't want to be an editor. He didn't want to be a publisher. He didn't want to be a business guy. He wanted to go out and be part of what was happening culturally, politically.
Tom Forcade did not like hippie music. If you look at the first 5 years of covers of High Times, you won't find the Grateful Dead, Pink Floyd, Rush, Yes, or any of the popular progressive rock or hippie rock groups of that time. But he put Debbie Harry on the cover. He put Johnny Rotten on the cover more than once. He did large feature stories on punk rock. Once upon a time, during the tour, I had just spent the evening with Sid Vicious, and I said to Tom, man, that guy is the most self-destructive person I've ever met in my life. And he said, no, he's not. I am. When Larry Flynt was shot in that attempted assassination, it caused a great deal of trouble for High Times, and it began the real problems for Tom. Everything had been smooth sailing for High Times up until that point. But once Larry Flynt was in the hospital, there was no one around to run his company, and payments from Flynt Distribution were late to High Times, and real money problems began. And that's when the people charged with managing High Times started to cause problems for Tom. Tom wanted to take the money the magazine was making and make a movie about the Sex Pistols. And the people who ran the magazine tried to prevent Tom from doing what he wanted to do.
All the cities, all the countries, before that long, long rest. Yeah, I'm going all the way. Yeah, I'm going all the way. I'm going all the way.
So when we got off tour with the Sex Pistols, Tom summoned all of the people who caused him problems with his movie, brought them into a room. Each employee was given a copy of Mao's little red book, a red star, and a ticket for a bus trip to the Diplomat Hotel where the ceremony was held.
And I had to get all the little Chairman Mao books, and I had to get little red star pins for everybody that was on the board. Jack Combs was there as the sergeant at arms. Jack was a big, tall drink of water. And he just stood there quietly in the back, his hands folded like this, kind of behind Tom. Just looking at him, just checking him out. Just checking him out. Strong and silent type. It was perfect. It's just like I said, I keep going back to these things and it's dramatic.
While he sat on a throne and ordered the villains to approach him, he summarily had them fired in a grand ceremony with the entire magazine staff in attendance. Tom was very theatrical. He understood the importance of street theater. So you never knew when Tom was putting you on, when he was acting, when he was depressed, when he was pretending to be depressed. He was like Andy Kaufman in his own way.
Long in the shadows of the great European powers, the United States emerged after World War II to command the world's greatest economic engine, centered around her merchants of steel, oil, and gunpowder, also known as the military-industrial complex. Right after the war to end all wars, I.G. Farben was manifested through John Foster Dulles' magic wand and some massive Wall Street loans. Although the corporation was split into pieces after the war, much like Standard Oil was divided by antitrust laws, one of Farben's divisions now owns Monsanto, leading to speculation on who won the peace. Elements of the Nazi empire were secretly imported into the USA to construct NASA and the CIA, among other projects. NASA was built on the back of German rocket science, and the CIA was built on the back of Gestapo science, some of which seems to have involved forbidden substances and mass mind control. Despite promises never to engage in operations on native soil, the CIA immediately corrupted our media, banking system, and major universities, while launching a mind control program known as MKUltra that mixed hypnosis with LSD in hopes of creating robot slaves. In 1963, the CIA asserted their dominance by assassinating President John F. Kennedy while deploying Nazi and MKUltra assets during the planning, execution, and cover-up. There are numerous dirty secrets held close to the vest, but JFK's murder remains the CIA's most worrisome secret. And through the decades, they've launched 1,000 memes to divide, misdirect, and confuse anyone attempting to penetrate the truth. This concerns one of those memes, a spoof religion called Discordianism. Meet the founder, Gregory Hill. Aside from the name, however, virtually nothing is known, and it took decades for the name to emerge because he was known only as Malakalypse the Younger. However, we do know some of the details on Hill's sidekick and co-conspirator, Kerry Thornley, who was in boot camp with Lee Harvey Oswald. In hindsight, it seemed possible Hill's real bio might contain some link to military intelligence, just as Thornley and Oswald may have been subjected to MKUltra experiments. The duo were forever entwined after the assassination. Thornley helped concoct a clever brew of fact and fantasy to create the CIA's original tinfoil hat patrol and spread a cloud of chaos over the case, one that has defined the spook-infested world of conspiracy theory. Thornley became an important witness for the Warren Commission, providing evidence Oswald was devoted to the communist cause. You see, it was very important a communist kill Kennedy. Thornley looked like a flower child and was obviously influenced by the Beats, Merry Pranksters, and Maynard G. Krebs, among others. But after his Warren Commission testimony, he attended a spook-infested summer camp in Colorado, popular with the Koch family, co-founders of the conspiracy-mongering John Birch Society. And upon graduation of that program, moved to California to become chummy with Johnny Roselli, one of JFK's assassins. Thornley then moved to Atlanta and commenced a long correspondence with Robert Anton Wilson, during a time Wilson was letters editor of Playboy magazine, the first and perhaps the only national magazine to interview District Attorney Jim Garrison. Garrison was a rare public official with balls enough to go up against the CIA. Wilson was mesmerized and soon heavily influenced by Thornley's tales of secret societies secretly running the world, a cosmology that bore similarities to the suddenly popular Morning of the Magicians, a text published in France in 1960 but released in America in 1963. One online reviewer sums the book up thusly: medieval alchemists producing atomic bombs and atomic fusion, the Nazi movement inspired by memory dreams of Atlantis. The earth is hollow and we live on the inside. The moon, Mars, and Jupiter and the stars are made of ice, and the three moons have crashed into Earth, producing great evolutionary jumps and de-evolutionary lapses like gypsies, Negroes, and Jews. Hill and Thornley wrote a similar opus for their goof religion, published in the style of an underground fanzine, a confusing mix of parody rituals, little-known Illuminati facts, tossed with horror fantasies plucked out of Edward Plunkett and H.P. Lovecraft, who'd invented terrifying tales of monstrous conspiracies at the beginning of the century. Horror fantasy held a magnetic attraction in the LSD-fueled 60s, and the higher people got, the harder it became to discern facts from fantasies, especially when so many fantasies revolved around the JFK assassination. It seems possible counterintelligence realized the Kennedy assassination could best be concealed by wrapping it inside the stories of magic powers and alien visitations to deceive the gullible and lead them into rabbit holes. Mae Russell came from a wealthy family, graduated from Stanford and Berkeley, and her father was a prominent rabbi in Los Angeles. She purchased all volumes of the Warren Commission as soon as available and launched a career as a radio host, examining holes in the official story. Her files on the subject became as large as Mary Farrell's. Later, her research appeared in Paul Krasner's Realist and attracted the attention of John Lennon, who donated money to help publish her book. Much of the work involved Operation Paperclip and the MKUltra and Nazi connections, Kennedy's assassination. In 1977, after publishing Illuminatus, Robert Anton Wilson was interviewed in Conspiracy Digest about the JFK assassination, the Illuminati, Aleister Crowley, UFOs, and other issues. Russell wrote a scathing response accusing Wilson, John Lilly, and Timothy Leary of being CIA stooges leading the youth into a fake drug-addled utopian fantasy involving space travel. Ask Leary or Wilson anything practical about today's miseries, and they changed the subject, she wrote. Wilson responded by denying he was a CIA dupe, insisting he was a high official of the agency since July 23, 1973. One of the primary precepts of Discordianism was never believe anything about anything, and Wilson never wavered from his role as a prankster deceiver. In hindsight, however, most of the nonsense people believe today about the Illuminati has roots in his fantasy trilogy, and his work shows little evidence of scholarly research into the history of the real Illuminati. Wilson believed the eye in the pyramid was an Illuminati invention and ridiculed the suggestion the society could have been a Jesuit penetration of Freemasonry. Actually, that is certainly one of the many valid possible explanations, not something to be ridiculed. According to Wilson, the Illuminati were good guys fighting against royalty and religion, and not some devious intelligence operation deploying ends justify the means morality codes. Wilson introduced the idea that the number 23 was an Illuminati concept. It never was, and usually insisted the society had died out shortly after being founded. He believed Oswald shot Kennedy and Garrison's investigation was a fraud. Wilson's biggest contribution to discordianism was called Operation Mindfuck, or OM, and involved disturbing a person's reality matrix with some mind-blowing conspiracy information and then trailing off into some make-believe maze of confusion. Life as Zen koan, wherein any sufficiently ambiguous answer works for any question whatsoever. If you ever got really high on psychedelics and had friends fuck with your head, you'll recognize the sadistic underpinnings of Operation Mindfuck and how it runs contrary to real investigations into conspiracies. Within a few years, however, Anthony Sutton published a factual book revealing how Yale University's Order of Skull and Bones deploys remarkably similar rituals as the original Illuminati. And the Bonesmen have successfully penetrated the upper levels of the CIA, investment banks, and military-industrial complex. Prescott Bush was a Bonesman and also acted as Hitler's banker on Wall Street, to the point of being chastised for trading with the enemy after the war. The society was created prior to the Civil War by a relative of the heir to the American Opium Cartel after visiting southern Germany and based off a secret fraternity he'd been inducted into while there. After establishing Bones, he became the biggest financial backer of John Brown, the terrorist who sparked the Civil War's armed confrontation. Brussels, in the meantime, was not up on Sutton's research. Instead, she began making outrageous claims, connecting dots that probably didn't connect, accusing almost every celebrity death of being orchestrated by the CIA for some nefarious purpose, much the same way every school shooting is instantly branded a fake event by today's tinfoil hat patrol. Brussels claimed there were immense assassination plots to derail youth culture, and claimed Charles Manson was a Manchurian candidate under hypnotic control. That seems to be one of the true things she may have uncovered. However, when Krasner began checking out her evidence for a potential book on Manson, he said it didn't add up. Krasner suffered a paranoid meltdown in his dentist's office and soon departed the plains of conspiracy theory. Meanwhile, Karl Koch was the son of a right-wing publisher in Germany, and he began rebelling against his dad as a teen. Karl had an early interest in computers as well as a fascination with the Illuminatus trilogy, claiming to have read the book 30 times. Karl may have been Wilson's biggest fan, and the two met briefly at a hacker convention. Karl was especially taken with the magic number 23 and seems to have swallowed Wilson's imaginative suggestion that George Washington could have been assassinated and replaced by Adam Weishaupt, something based solely on a slight resemblance between the two men and the fact the eye in the triangle appears on U.S. currency, even though Weishaupt never used that symbol. Of course, it was all OM, and Karl got mind-fucked. Despite operating with only a primitive Commodore 64, Karl successfully penetrated a number of military-industrial websites around the world and sold passwords and other information to the KGB to the tune of tens of thousands of dollars, a connection established by his cocaine dealers. Most of the money he earned from hacking flowed back into the dealers' hands. Karl descended into a paranoid cocaine-induced psychosis for a while. Meantime, the German authorities offered up a hacker's amnesty in order to crack the subculture, and Karl took the offer, but was soon found in a forest, burnt to a crisp. Strangely, his death was ruled as suicide. But a more likely explanation is the drug dealers killed him in retaliation for going state's evidence. Karl died on May 23, 1989.
He had a copy of Jane's that there's a publication about airplanes. He was always reading it. And he was always looking at airplanes on sale. And the sad thing is, at one point he did buy an airplane. And Jack went and did a training course in Florida somewhere that I used to laugh and make fun of him and say, "You're taking a crash course, Jack. Why are you taking this crash course? I mean, it doesn't sound too safe to me, And in the end, it wasn't. The first time he flew, the first time that he flew, and Tom was in Florida. I remember I was in New York. Tom and I were married then. We lived in a loft over Bruno's Bakery on LaGuardia Place in Soho, and Tom I knew was in Florida, and that Jack was, they were both elated because they finally had this plane and Jack was flying it. And I remember I was running a bath one night at home, and I didn't expect Tom back, but he walked in the door and he was really quiet, and he said, "How are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm better now that you're back. That's great. It's great to see you." And then he started sobbing. He sobbed and he sobbed and he sobbed, and he couldn't even get out words. Just sat on the edge of the bed sobbing. And then he told me that Jack crashed, that Jack's plane crashed, and that Jack was dead. And Tom became increasingly depressed from that point on. I think that was in the beginning of a fall period, you know, like autumn, and maybe September or something like that. And it just got worse.
There was the famous birthday party, the Tom Forcade birthday party. John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd were there. Other cast members of Saturday Night Live, a lot of rock stars, a lot of people from High Times. So we didn't know what to get Tom. We decided to get him a little model kit and a tube of airplane glue. When we gave him his present, he opened up the airplane glue, put it in the paper bag, and huffed it, just for a joke. They were already putting mustard gas in glue by then, so kids couldn't huff it, but everybody thought that was very funny.
And he sat down and just sat there. And I was on my way out, and he had become a dark cloud. I'm trying to think. You know, I think of it as Joe Bliffle-Splick, you know, the guy who's with the cloud over his head, and Joe Palooka. I don't know, is it Lil Abner cartoons, you know? He's always got the rain on his shoulder. And he was so intense, it was hard to take. So he would just sit there and not say anything. And it would be hard. I mean, you never saw anyone so miserable in your life. And I finally, like after I finished getting everything together and was ready to go out, I went, "Okay, why'd you come over?" Because he hadn't said anything. And he went, "Well, I came over because you always make me laugh." And I actually yelled at him for putting me in that situation where I didn't really feel like laughing, and now I have to be your jokester, you know?
One time I remember is when we had a party for Punk Magazine, and things didn't go well because Sid Vicious, the news that Sid Vicious had killed Nancy had just hit the media, and the media was trying to get in the party and get our reactions and focus on the negativity of Nancy Spongen's death. And Tom saw me after the party when I felt inconsolable about how badly everything had gone that night, because it was near riot, and the owners of the club had pulled a gun on us and taken the receipts. And he put his hand on my shoulder and told me everything was great and tried to lift my spirits.
But when Tom went to Hollywood, he did that too, and that's when he got this gun. And Tom had never been the least violent. I mean, I never saw him hurt anything or, I mean, he had this gun. I didn't quite understand why he had the gun, but I think he got a little paranoid I also never saw him do cocaine. I mean, he might do a line or two, but you know, I know so many people who have been at parties who, you know, where there were bowls of cocaine. I have never personally in my life seen that. I mean, I was still sheltered even in the midst of this incredible maelstrom of like being in the center of the culture with the guy who started the whole, you know, industry of like High Times chronicling it and all of that. You know, I guess Tom probably protected me from that too. He didn't want me to become some sort of a coke head, which thank God I didn't. Because people around us were, you know, people then, there were so many casualties of drugs, whether they died or they just became useless from abusing drugs. And Tom was really against that. I don't know how many people really, certainly nobody believed me after he died. I don't know if people would now believe me, but we used to talk about it a lot, Tom and I. And I mean, he really did want to take the magazine in a different direction because he was feeling responsible for Jack, and he was feeling responsible if the magazine was going to get people, you know, abusing drugs and ruining their lives. So, I don't know.
I remember telling Gabrielle to get rid of Tom's gun. Because I knew he had like a gun in the freezer or something like that. Right. Had money and gun in the freezer.
He was obviously in a terrible depression. He went through this though in winters. He would get in bed and he wouldn't get out of bed. I mean, and that day I was making lunch. I was making stuffed eggplant that Tom would never have eaten. He didn't like vegetables, but he liked tacos. But I remember Jim Drugas, who, remember Tom started this bookstore, New Morning in Soho. There was no bookstore, and we used to look out and say, God, we have to walk miles to get a newspaper, miles to get a magazine, miles to get a book. And I said, why don't you start a bookstore? And he did. It was great. New Morning Bookstore, after the Dylan Dylan album, I think it was. And so Jim Drugas came into our lives because he was the first, I guess, manager of the bookstore, and he was terrific. And he's still in the book business. Anyway, Jim was over that day. Tom was in the bedroom of our loft, and we were in the front room, Jim and I, talking about the bookstore, and I was making stuffed eggplant. And Jim was a vegetarian. He was always a vegetarian. And so we were going to eat the stuffed eggplant. I remember going into Tom saying, Jim's here. Do you want to come out and have lunch with us? And I'll make you some tacos. No, thanks. I said, well, can I get you anything? And he said, no, just the fact that you're here is great. And I said, well, I'm going to get you some cranberry juice. So I went into the front room, got some cranberry juice, brought it back to the bedroom, gave it to Tom, who said, thanks a lot. And I went back into the living room and shut the door so he could sleep. And the next thing Jim and I know, we heard a gun shot. And it was almost like, who would know it was a gunshot? We didn't even really, it was just a horrifying noise, a scary noise.
And there were many times when I called Tom at his home, and he would pick up the phone, and Stevie wouldn't say anything. So I thought, oh, fuck it, I'm just going to launch. I went, hi, Tom, it's Maureen. This is what we've got. We've got all the cans filmed, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And then I hear the phone going, he had just shot himself. He had just shot himself.
And we ran into the bedroom, and there was Tom. There was Tom with this side of his head. He had shot himself. So that's what happened. And I swear, I don't know whether, Tom could have been doing Russian roulette. I don't think there was a bullet in other chambers. That's the kind of depressed that he was, and the kind of person that he was about irony. And, he could have thought, well, if I die, I die. And if I don't die, I'm not supposed to die. But this is definitely how bad I feel.
So I got back to the office, and everybody was saying, where are you? Where were you, Maureen? We were trying to find, of course there was no cell phones. Where were you, Maureen? We were trying to find you. Tom's at St. Vincent's. And I said, what's Tom at St. Vincent's for? Well, he shot himself. That's what happened.
And then I had to go to the hospital, and he was brain dead. And, I was 26. I had to just say, well, he wouldn't want to live like this. There was no way he was going to be alive or live. And I just said, no, you can stop the machines. And because we'd talked about that kind of stuff. And, it was, after that, it was a horror show, really, a horror show. Some people thought I murdered Tom. People who had no idea, jealous people, crazy people, paranoid people. There were people who came to, I moved to a different loft. I mean, I couldn't stay there. I got a different place. And people would come and spray paint murderer outside of my door, on my door. And at one point I needed bodyguards. It was and then there was a lawsuit. That's when I found out how much High Times was worth. So really, it was quite horrible. When Tom died, I still wish he were alive now. I do. I know he would so love Obama. He would so be happy with what's going on today.
I was about 10 blocks away in my loft with my girlfriend at the time, Deanne Stillman, who was close to Cindy, and I don't know, we were all pretty shook up about it. I went to the hospital, and I looked through the door, and I saw him there with the tube. Who else was there? I guess Wilcock was there. And I was really upset about it.
And then I found out he blows his head off. So I felt bad about that, but he did make it hard to relate to him at the end.
He was obviously in a pit of black depression, but he had been in that kind of pit before and come out of it and been absolutely brilliant and ebullient and warm, loving kindness, and then gone back into it and come out of it. He'd done that often enough that obviously it was only a matter of time until something like that happened. Yeah.
But the last time I talked to him was 2 days before he died, and I called him up and said, I met someone who could help our business, and this is exactly the person we've been looking for. His name was Spacely, and he was like an old compadre of Tom's. He was a member of the SDP family, but he was into punk rock, and he was just the guy that Tom and I were looking for. He told me to call Maureen and make an appointment with his secretary. And I think it was a day or two later that I heard the news on the radio that he passed away.
And Tom was so wildly in love with life. So he had that wonderful ability that creative people have of being able to turn you on to life by example. He had everything to live for at that time, I felt. We made lots of plans. We had all sorts of things we were going to do, and he really had nothing to die for, and I still don't understand why he killed himself. I miss Tom Forcade a lot. Like I said, there aren't people who do things anymore. I think that he changed the country through abetting High Times, in the same sense that William Burroughs changed the country through his writing, or Andy Warhol and through his painting. He was a very special person. I'm glad we're remembering him here today.
I don't know, the thing with this, like Forcade and Abbey, basically they left the Youth International Party members in a lurch. They're guilty of child abandonment. We're youth. Who is there to guide me anymore? Who would I go to if I'm depressed and I want to have some demonstration? Who's going to put me in the right direction? Who's going to Forcade, So we lost two great American revolutionaries when they committed suicide, and it's just so odd that they both of them went down that way. It's just it's just something that was, I never expected it to be that way, but
We started a magazine called Joint, the magazine for the captive audience, and Chick was the editor, and I was the publisher, so we spent a lot of time in that place, which used to be the Smokeezy, putting together this crazy magazine. And Chick was a nutcase in five ways of bad.
Well, Chick had good bona fides. He did time for allegedly bombing the Bank of America. He knew Lenny Bruce, he knew Albert Coleman. Chick told me one night, Chick was like a triple agent. He couldn't be loyal to anybody. So he told me one night, he says, it was my best friend that sold Lenny the smack he OD'd on.
But at one point I was supposed to have an editorial meeting with him, and he was down in Miami at some dope motel where there was a buyer and a seller on every floor in every room, and he was going in and out. He was the ringleader, and I'm sitting there, and Albert was there, and I'll never forget that motherfucker. He says, he's sitting there, so we're just sitting there smoking dope and drinking. Well, he was drinking scotch. He fancied himself a sort of, F. Scott Fitzgerald monkey, so we're talking about literature and this, and at some point Albert says to me, "You don't know what you're talking about. I've got a degree from Columbia, And I just looked at him and said, "Fuck you, you fat fuck." And that was it. I mean, we're sitting there in a dope motel, and he's telling me about his Columbia degree.
But the thing is, Albert is the one who introduced Chick to Tom.
Yeah. Well, the thing about Albert was he was never a street guy. He didn't know fuck all about the street. And he was totally taken in by Chick. It was like, street chic, outlaw chic. I mean, he loved what the French call, and I'll get pretentious here, nostalgie de la boue. He loved to get in the gutter because, it made him feel, like he was alive or some shit like that. But he was a jerk, and you could con him, and he was conned, and you read his books, and he was conned all his life, and he put that out as the truth in his books. So that's his fucking legacy.
The staff members of his magazines would double cross him, and other friends would turn out to be informers, and he was afraid always of ending up in jail.
The thing with Chick was, he's telling me practically fucking nothing. And one night he tells me, my uncle, who was in the bagel business and used to work for the government, he tells me I should sell you pot at a real low price so you have plenty of room to make a profit, because your investigation is important to this nation and is underfunded. So once again, there's Chick ratting out the fucking, the feds. Like what happened to Chick eventually was the feds gave him like 20 grand, make a buy. He had a week to do it. He said, I put the money out in the street, double it, have 40 grand, make the buy, and everything will be cool. But he got ripped off. They arrested him for defrauding the federal government. Yeah, Chick eventually, he died in jail. He pulled some shit on the feds. And
How did he die in jail?
They misdiagnosed him, and he died a terrible death, according to Albert.